Okay, I think we're going to start right now. Good morning from New York. Good afternoon to Europe and good evening to other parts of the world. Welcome to this second webinar in a series that was started by the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung offices in New York and Geneva, where we are about to explore systemic challenges, systemic needs for a global just transition. The two UN offices of Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung want to talk about what is just in a just transition, because when it comes to the details, it turns out that just means different things for different people who live in different situations. Today, we want to focus on the United States because as the historical major emitter in history, one of the wealthiest nation in the world, and where a lot of policies are determined that are, of course, important for the just transition. And so today we have as guest Dharna Noor and our project manager Aaron Eisenberg to interview her. And so I give the floor to Aaron and Dharna. Thank you for being with us, and go ahead.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Andreas, and thank you for being here, Dharna. And thank you all for joining us today. So as Andreas said, this is the second one in a series. We will be continuing this into next year and working to really expand what just transition means and how we go about thinking about just transition beyond traditional definitions potentially, but taking into account the true global implications and global justice implications. To that end, we had a great webinar last week internally where we kind of started to think about that, but it's very hard to do any of these questions without tackling the United States. The United States is, as Andreas said, the world's largest historical emitter. It is the hegemonic power in the world, or at least one of two. And it is really kind of, as the US goes, some international politics goes. And so there was the Paris Agreement, there's all of this run up since Paris, and we decided to kind of focus in on the US because this year in the US has been a lot on climate politics. It's been very exciting in some levels, but also hard to decipher. It's been something where, especially for our global audience, I know people have looked at us and said, we are doing great or we're doing terribly, depending on who you're talking to. And so we wanted to have you here, Dharna, to kind of run through this and really kind of leave our audience knowing where we stand and what we're going to be going into. So I think a great place to start out is probably thinking about what has happened this year. And I am thinking specifically of two things: the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and the West Virginia versus EPA case. And so perhaps you can start us off and give us like an overview of each of what those two things are and what they mean for international climate politics.
Absolutely. It's funny, you know, when Aaron and I were preparing for this conversation, I kept thinking, and I would say to Aaron, oh, I feel like these are such impossible questions, and maybe I'm not the right person to do this, because I sometimes feel that I don't have my head around the question of what's going on with US climate policy. And then I thought about it and realized I don't think there's a single person who can give a definitive answer on whether climate policy has been overall good, whether it will reduce emissions, you know, what exactly the environmental justice implications of all of it will be. So great to be here to untangle this with all of you. So to start with the Inflation Reduction Act, you know, it's a bill that's completely chock full of contradictions. It's a massive spending bill on the part of the US. In relationship to, you know, many other things that the US has done in the past. And for our purposes, I think what we should really zero in on is that the bill earmarks $369 billion for climate and clean energy policies, renewable energy, some other kind of, you know, more questionable things like carbon capture and storage, things like this. That's really significant. In fact, it's the biggest investment in, climate policies broadly considered of any policy in US history. It's the biggest investment in climate that the US has ever made. That said, it's also way, way less than what we actually need. In reporting on this, economist Mark Paul told me the Inflation Reduction Act provides hundreds of billions of dollars in funding toward the transition, but we're at a time when we need trillions of dollars. And, it's not only less than what we need, it's also, it really pales in comparison to what we were promised at various points, in comparison to, for instance, an earlier iteration of the bill known as Build Back Better. That bill would have earmarked $555 billion for carbon reducing programs, again, considered broadly. There were some measures from that were sort of cut out. On the campaign trail, President Biden promised to spend $2 trillion on climate. This is far from that, of course. So, a bill that I think we would be remiss not to consider how massive it is in comparison to history, but it also illustrates how poorly the US has invested in climate change and in fighting climate change, rather, in its long history. To speak for a bit about West Virginia versus EPA, this was a really major court ruling wherein essentially the Supreme Court, the highest court in the US, severely, essentially, restricted the federal government's ability to fight the climate crisis via regulation, because the court determined that the Environmental Protection Agency, which is an extremely important regulatory body here in the US that regulates everything from highway emissions to power plant emissions, things like this. It ruled that the Environmental Protection Agency does not have the authority to broadly regulate coal and gas-fired power plants for their climate warming emissions. This doesn't, unfortunately, really affect current policy, not unfortunately because it should, but the reason is that the US really doesn't have all that much regulation on the books right now on power plants, planet warming pollution. But it could deal a really serious blow to future efforts and could have even more far-reaching effects that we'll talk a little bit more about later.
And just for chronology, the West Virginia versus EPA decision happened before the IRA, correct?
Yes.
Was there, from what I understand, there were things in the IRA that were a direct response. Is that true as well, that the IRA kind of gained some steam after perhaps being in the gutter with Build Back Better because of this West Virginia decision?
Well, so there were some representatives who essentially, said that they had worded some things in the Inflation Reduction Act in order to be able to overcome some of the challenges in the Supreme Court ruling. I think we'll have to wait to see whether or not that actually makes much of a difference. I think, currently we're in a sort of situation in our court system in the US where the right is, really willing to essentially take creative risks, take just completely very, very creative liberties with the way that they interpret law and doctrine in order to essentially get the result that they want. I think that's not even very controversial to say at this point. And so I think we'll have to wait and see what the actual effect of that is. But yes, there were some attempts for sure.
Cool. So then I guess my next question is, based off of this, where do the movements stand? Like, where are we? COP is 2 weeks away, just over 2 weeks away right now. What is the vibe like in the US right now as we enter the COP? What are people talking about? Are they looking to this COP to kind of build on that momentum? What is going on right now?
It's been really interesting to be a climate reporter before this COP. If you are following these negotiations, that this will be a really, really important set of negotiations, kind of especially in the wake of recent floods in Pakistan and other sort of horrible disasters in the global south. The call for loss and damages, something like reparations, is going to be a lot louder. In the US, though, there's really been very little conversation about it. Even we'll talk with representatives from Massachusetts and from other states who have gone to previous COPs. Many people say that they're sitting this one out. There's been very little media coverage of this coming COP. And I think part of the reason why, frankly, is because everyone is really concerned about what they see as the more immediate issues facing them. Everyone's really concerned about gas prices. Everyone's concerned about inflation. And I think that, at this moment, I would venture to guess that part of the reason we're here now is because there's been a lot of trouble, frankly, in the past with connecting climate change and the need to sort of, slow climate change with those material issues that face people every day. We had some movement, obviously, with the sort of building momentum for the Green New Deal in the United States that definitely helped to combat that. But by and large, I still think that we have this idea in the States that climate policy cannot be done essentially without increasing costs for people. Maybe it will create jobs too, but there's a really, I think, a lot of concern about that. And I think that that's maybe part of the reason that we're not seeing so much coverage, even though these negotiations will be very important.
And perhaps another thing about it is the midterm election coming up at the same time, right?
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
Is that something that in the past that has kind of influenced why COPs have been more or less reported on in the US, or not really something?
It's a good question. I mean, I probably, but also the midterms, there's a lot of concern about midterm elections always. But I think that these feel particularly significant for a lot of folks in the United States because there's a lot of concern. I think there's a lot of concern because there's a lot of reason for concern that the Democrats will lose their majorities. And so, on the one hand, if you're choosing to stay home and campaign or work on the midterm elections, I think that you have a pretty easy reason to be doing that. On the other hand, it's pretty hard to get climate on the agenda when you are not even be able to sort of build excitement and momentum around these really crucial negotiations. So it's a bizarre contradiction, I think.
Totally. So then I guess like my question is, based off of this year, where is the climate movement in the US, and what is the climate movement in the US, I guess? And where does it stand? Because as in the intro, we talked about how you were talking about how it's woefully inadequate, the IRA, but also is the largest investment ever in climate. What is the movement feeling right now? Are there more cohesive a movement than ever, or is it something that has kind of people have sour grapes after these wins or non-wins this summer, depending on how people look at it?
Yeah, it's interesting. Because I'm a reporter, I think that I sort of get to hear the way the sort of raw emotions that people feel in the wake of policy passing in ways that maybe folks in the movement wouldn't necessarily say to each other. So I think that the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, really illustrated some of the sort of fractures in the climate movement, some of the biggest questions that the climate movement is definitely asking itself. There are, for instance, questions about how exactly climate policy should be enacted. The major climate initiatives in the Inflation Reduction Act are basically incentives for both individuals and corporations, and to a lesser extent, public entities, to move away from polluting forms of power and transit. So that includes things like, tax breaks and rebates and things like this. And there are many people who are very happy that this marks a shift away from, thinking about things like carbon taxes and things like this. It's a way to sort of see investment in climate policy as the key to it. But there are also many questions, obviously, about whether or not this is the most effective way to reduce emissions, whether tax breaks are something that we can rely on. Also, I should have said even earlier, there are some pretty horrible sort of concessions that were made in the IRA. Many of them concessions to the sort of rightmost members of the Democratic Party who, sort of threatened not to vote for the bill if they didn't get the things that they want. Some of them, for instance, are that the legislation would require the US to hold lease auctions in the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska, essentially allowing for the drilling of more oil and gas, and reinstate some lease sales that were previously scheduled but were canceled, meaning in some ways it will mandate, that more oil and gas is drilled for. It mandates that more public lands be offered for oil and gas leasing before any renewable energy projects can be built on public lands or waters. Again, sort of, continuing this sort of legacy of extraction into the future, which not only means that, we'll be a few years behind on climate policy, it essentially locks us into the use of fossil fuels for probably decades to come if the oil and gas industry sort of take the bait and do, kind of use these leases. And there are some other concerns too. There are some huge concerns about environmental justice, about the implications there. There are some pretty big concerns about the fact that oil companies themselves could be making money off of the Inflation Reduction Act if they, for instance, invest in things like carbon capture and things like this. And so I think, seeing what the various parts of the climate movement's reaction have been to this really, again, sort of illustrates the differences of opinion within it, the biggest fights coming up. There are people who have essentially said that, it's worth making these concessions, many others who say that it's not worth making these concessions. And it really, there's models that show what the effects will be on environmental justice, on emissions, things like this. But really, I think we have to take models, as always, with many, many grains of salt, and we just have to see what the terrain becomes now. If anything, I think what this shows is that it's created for the conditions for a different kind of organizing, because now there are policies on the books, and now a lot of it will be about implementation and about rolling back some of those more harmful policies.
And I guess to that point, I think you touched upon a really important cleavage that's kind of emerging. There was this attempted side deal, right? This that was beaten down by many of these environmental justice communities and allies, saying that Joe Manchin would agree to the Inflation Reduction Act if this other bill to greenlight pipelines and greenlight projects would come on the books. And there's kind of been, I've seen this debate online, and curious your kind of thoughts on this, but there's kind of a cleavage now where it's people saying we need to get as much renewable energy on the grid as possible. And to do so, we have to be able to say to fossil fuel interests, it's okay to build more. And there is a really emerging strong backlash to that, thankfully, or in my view, thankfully, perhaps guiding the question, but that's saying, no, we do not need to accept more fossil fuel infrastructure for renewable infrastructure. And can you talk through kind of where this has emerged from and what kind of this cleavage is? Because I think it's really the guiding one in the post-IRA world in the US right now.
Yeah, totally. This is a great question. So essentially, the way that this side deal worked is that, the West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, who should be noted has made millions of dollars from the coal industry, has taken, sort of massive donations from, coal, from pipeline distributors, things like this. Made a deal essentially saying, yes, I will vote for your big spending package, even though I'm very skeptical of it, if you allow me to, essentially enshrine another policy that I've been looking to enshrine for years. This would essentially make it easier to build all kinds of infrastructure, whether that's, dirty energy infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure. It would essentially sort of bulldoze the requirements for, community engagement. It would, kind of limit the window during which communities can sue the developers of new infrastructure if they find them to be harmful. And, the response to this, I think, was pretty all over the map from folks who are concerned about the climate, because many sort of noted, we do need to reform permitting if we're going to bring more renewable power online. We do need to massively, for instance, increase electricity transmission. We frequently don't talk about the need to increase transmission as we sort of transition to renewable energy overall. And so there was some, that sort of said it's wrong-headed to combat this bill, to fight against this side deal, just because it will allow more fossil fuel infrastructure to come online, because we do need parts of it. If there is anything good to take away from this, it's that people in the climate movement are really sort of openly starting to talk about the need for transmission, and I think that's great. I also think that it's really telling and really scary that it took this for that to happen, that it took, the threat of, at a time when we know that, that we essentially cannot expand fossil fuel infrastructure at all if we're going to, kind of win a livable future, that it took something that threatened to expand the capability for fossil fuel companies to have infrastructure projects like this greenlit in order to get this conversation going at all. I guess I'm sort of saying what I think about the side deal. I guess what I'll sort of more explicitly say is, of course, we need to talk more about transmission. If these are the terms of the conversation, though, the conversation will never result in something that kind of does achieve the livable future that we need to be talking about so badly. So,
yeah, I think it goes to that point where you do not need to take a poison pill just to take a poison pill. You can if you, for example, very much believed in passing this legislation was necessary for those specific clauses, introduce a new bill with those specific clauses. You do not need to take more fossil fuel infrastructure right after you say that you're doing all of this for the climate. And so I think there have been a lot of legislators trying to have their cake and eat it too on this and trying to figure out where they stand. I think this is also bringing it to a more that we've kind of focused in and honed in very much on domestic issues here. But I want to kind of broaden the scope now because this webinar series is about global just transition and global justice. And so like beyond what we just heard, there is like a strain that are saying these oil and gas exports are actually necessary as a global justice conception, saying that there will be massive blackouts around the world. And I'm specifically thinking of Adam Tooze, who's a pretty influential left-wing historian economist who has a lot of backers from the economy space and economic space. And I think his quote was like, this pipeline problem might matter only to local climates, but there needs to be more American gas made available on the global market, because otherwise there's not going to be enough gas on the global market and there will be actual rolling blackouts everywhere around the world. And so for people in the global south who he supposedly talked to, they're calling for more gas on the table, which sounds ludicrous to me. It sounds the exact opposite of every call from the global south in any of these spaces that are as we're running up to COP. However, it does showcase like how identity can be wielded in such ways and kind of made for perverse arguments like this. And so I guess the question is, in the US, are questions of global justice actually being talked about, or is it kind of a paternalistic, to pass domestic policy, we're going to use the international as a kind of token or as something to wield points in my argument? Or are there actual questions of global justice being included in the US climate space right now?
It's a very difficult question. In some ways, Adam Tooze was considering the implications of global justice in this, right? He was at least, at least saying that he was considering the implications of our energy policy. I think if anything, this sort of highlights the need to talk with folks in various parts of the world more. It highlights a need for more sort of collaboration and more communication. It's definitely possible to me that somebody in the global south, that many people in fact in the global south do say that their nations need more American gas. That's entirely possible to me that people are saying that, because in the short term that is the sort of option that people have been given. The question, I think, is how does the sort of global north and global south come together to create new options? How do we sort of break out of the sort of dichotomy of blackouts versus more gas pipelines, more gas sort of shipped across seas? I think it's pretty easy to fearmonger about blackouts, about high gas prices, especially at a time when we're seeing them sort of increase at like record rates. But if this isn't the time to start sort of talking through what it would mean to get off of fossil fuels, when we're seeing how volatile they are, how dangerous they are for not only us here in the States, but for sort of everyone around the world. I think that really we've missed a huge opportunity. I guess I'll also say that I agree with you. That sort of highlights the fact that you can find somebody, it's saying that you've like learned something from somebody in the global South, I think is often really misleading. There are many people with different sort of class interests and different sort of, power dynamics in the global South. Obviously, talking to the head of a state, you might get a very different opinion from talking to, a working class person in that state. And so I think it really highlights the need to, to build movements of people who kind of have shared interests, and maybe those shared interests are not immediately the same insofar as anybody in the sort of global North is benefiting from things like global imperialism. I think that's debatable, but whatever. But certainly, if we all have a shared interest in, having a planet that we can live on and things like this, then certainly we have shared interests, and that's what we should sort of be building along the lines of.
Cool. And yeah, so to that point, like, I think imperialism is a real point to be talking about right now, as the European energy crisis is happening due to Russian imperialism into the Ukraine and kind of reliance on fossil fuels and gas. And so towards that, something that has been kind of disappointing and disheartening, and is something that the climate movement, in my summation, has to reckon with, is since the kind of response to the Iraq war, there hasn't been that kind of left anti-imperialism movement globally that has been really kind of dynamic and strong. There was I'd say a liberal response to the Ukraine invasion here this year, but like Syria, Yemen, there hasn't been the kind of response necessary to build that type of movement you're talking about. And the climate movement often is talked about in these types of frames as well. It's like Mike Davis's influential piece in the early 2000s, Who Will Build the Ark? But it's basically in the aftermath of Katrina, in the aftermath of Sandy, in the aftermath of Pakistan, after these floods, after typhoons, it's like, oh, is this going to be the thing that will wake people up? And it's not really a knowledge question. It's kind of a building those working class solidarities across boundaries, because towards fighting against either fossil capital or fighting against kind of imperial capital in this way. And how does that kind of play out like when the transition in the global North is going on that is still predicated on extraction? Like, what is, because I want to get into a little just deeper, what are the solutions that are being put forward or kind of being funded in these kind of bills like the IRA? Because like, from my understanding, is trying to build the leading hydrogen hub, or building the leading, using lithium and making America compete with China for electric vehicles, and trying to do all of this stuff. And so like, how do these dynamics play out when rare earth minerals are involved? How do these dynamics play out when kind of the conditions remain the same of global North extraction from global South, with now a kind of closing timeline that we talk about?
You mentioned that knowledge is not enough, and I fully agree with that. That said, I do think that those who are producing the knowledge are sort of starting to get on board with this. We saw that last year's IPCC report for the first time sort of called out colonialism as a primary driver of the climate crisis. And so, I think at least insofar as people's thinking affects climate policy, there's some sort of movement on that front. That said, there are some big questions that I think, that the American climate policy will really have to reckon with. There are some pretty huge international implications of the Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, that we just don't know exactly how they'll play out. A big one that you sort of started to mention is changes to the electric vehicle rebate program. The moment that President Biden signed the bill, this new requirement essentially kicked in, meaning that to qualify for federal credits to buy an electric vehicle now, your EV has to be assembled in North America. That change immediately meant that just 20 or 21 models of electric vehicles in North America became eligible because, the EV market is not exactly thriving in the United States, and particularly, it's really dominated by China. These provisions are pretty clearly a way to sort of attempt to push China out of the market. And there are more stipulations that are sort of set to be phased in sometime starting next year. Soon, qualifying cars will have to use batteries that are built in North America or made with a certain percentage of minerals mined or recycled from either North America or a trade partner country. Again, obviously, China does not qualify for that, even though it currently refines like 73% of the world's cobalt or something like this. It has a huge sort of huge hold on the market right now. And I think, the implications of this, I think, could be really complicated. It was sort of sold as a way to up domestic manufacturing, kind of protect American labor, things like this, and to, combat some of the sort of reported human rights violations happening in China. But, it's having some, I think, pretty bizarre unintended consequences. The European Union and South Korea and Japan, of all places, are already seemingly pretty pissed about these new provisions because they say that the law's sourcing requirements disadvantage their car and battery manufacturers. All of this, I think, is just to say that, having these sort of simple, these very simple seeming sort of concessions or provisions in these massive policy packages can really affect like the landscape of geopolitics in huge ways. There's a lot of questions about whether or not these sort of provisions are even allowed under the WTO. There's a lot of concern about this sort of stoking tensions with China. And so, even something that was just, sort of one page in, hundreds can sort of reshape our geopolitical landscape. And unless I think the climate movement goes into policy with that knowledge, unless everyone sort of understands that anything that we do to, procure clean energy, to procure these electric vehicles, to change our landscapes in the US, anything essentially that we do will have these geopolitical complications, whether that's because of the different markets, whether that's because of where, where minerals need to be mined, things like this. Unless we sort of understand this international playing field, we will always, I think, be, at risk of putting people essentially in really horrible positions abroad.
Totally. I harken back to a project we did at Rosa-Lux a couple of years ago called, and you can shameless plug for everyone on the call, but it's called greennewtrade.org. And it was because similar to what you're talking about, we recognized that the trade people and the climate people or Green New Deal people weren't really speaking. And when you brought up these WTO rules or what could be challenged here or what these provisions could be, it kind of all comes together, whereas until we have climate justice viewed as trade justice, viewed as economic justice, viewed as racial justice, viewed as anti-imperialism, it all becomes kind of more product for continuing the green growth agenda. And kind of it's how we end up with kind of no rebates, I believe, in the IRA for kind of electric bikes or electric scooters, but rebates in the IRA for electric Hummers that have been brought back from the dead that never existed and now are thousands and thousands of pounds because the kind of these conceptions are not brought in together. It's kind of continuing to build bigger and grow more on these. And so it's kind of a question there, like where do you see these like connections being built, or are they being built in the US right now? Because like I'm thinking specifically going into COP, what are like the key area? You talked about loss and damage being a key spot right now. Are there kind of connections between these disparate movements that are being built at this time in the US?
I think that things are beginning to change, certainly. I think, again, just the mere mention of colonialism in an IPCC report is an indicator that at least, in the literature and in sort of activist movements, things are beginning to change. And I think that part of the reason might be that, folks here in the global north are starting to realize that, the disasters happening in the global south are obviously, horrible, and we should be doing something about them for altruistic reasons, but also they're harbingers of what we have in store for us here. There are ways to sort of protect our own interests, by essentially making sure that that other nations can weather the storms and typhoons and things that are building there. Um, I do think, though, that there's a long way to go with, sort of understanding the many like actual mechanisms of how these things work. I think that we're just starting to see, for instance, more consideration of things like the IMF in the sort of climate space. The sort of implications of international debts, things like this. And I mean, it's really exciting, I think, to see, more consideration of things like the IMF, the World Bank, because obviously these are the sort of international actors that will have a huge, sort of determining force in whether or not certain nations are able to survive. Um, Looking at debt, looking at, the sort of past history of responsibility for emissions. All of these are really important aspects of any sort of climate policy. So yeah, I think that there are definitely opportunities for change. But I also think it's difficult times right now to be asking people to look abroad. Again, when folks are so concerned about the inflation crisis that they're seeing, when folks are so concerned about how they're going to put food on their table, how they're going to put gas in their car to get to work every day. I don't think that it's easy. I don't think it's easy to sort of say, we should also be considering what's happening in other parts of the world. But it's really our only choice, right? There's no way that the United States can treat itself as an actor that is anything other than a global hegemon, as the greatest historical emitter, as in many ways a sort of shaper of climate policy on the international level. That's the only sort of option for the US if we're going to have a planet that we can survive on.
Yeah, and I would be remiss to not bring in the military as well, at that kind of stage where the US military is also on its own would be one of the world's largest emitters and has no pathway to kind of scaling down, and is something movements in the US are really need to kind of focus on as a way to reallocate that money and really kind of figure this out.
Yeah, absolutely. And the United States is a reason why that hasn't really been like a sort of conversation happening at any of the COPs in the past. In addition to sort of creating the pushing against things like loss and damages, pushing against things like reparations for nations that have emitted less. In addition to that, the United States is also a major reason that at the COPs, there's no talk of military emissions really. And so, that paradigm will have to change. The US will have to, in some ways, go somehow from being a entity that really blocks any sort of progress on this, on that stage to, one that at the very least makes room for progress, if not sort of pushes it forward itself.
Cool. And so I'll do one more question until we open up to the floor. Something that I was framing it as, and I've heard other people do this as well, is in this post-IRA, there are many good things, there are many bad things as we've gone through, that for movements that I'm part of and outside of like my work life, if it's not the worst climate law in the next 5 years, then we fundamentally failed. And for others, it's kind of, this is very good, and this is what's going to get us to what they view as the future that's needed. But looking on the agenda after this COP, but both this COP, but right after this COP, what do you see as things for our global audience to look forward to going on in the US on climate? Like, what are key next steps, key things to be looking out for? Is there more West Virginia versus EPAs down the pipe? And specifically pipe because it's a pipe like pipeline bills. What should these people all be looking out for on this? And then what is your personal hope for the COP is kind of the last one there.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess to start with the first question first, definitely there are more things to be looking for down the pipe. Definitely there are more West Virginia versus EPAs. not only in the sense that, there are other sort of major Supreme Court cases that could have huge implications for domestic climate policy, things that could, for instance, threaten the future of the Clean Water Act. That's a big one that we're kind of looking at coming up. But also because the implications of West Virginia versus EPA could be far reaching. They could essentially work such that it's not only that the federal government has less capability to regulate power plant emissions, but it also could mean that the US has sort of less freedom overall to regulate in ways that it is not explicitly given permission to by the Constitution. So for instance, there are kind of rules that are in the works at the SEC that would essentially mean that corporations have to disclose how much risk their assets are under because of climate change. And that might not be able to go through because of this. There's some concern about that not being able to go through because of the Supreme Court decision. I think broadly, we're looking at many different kinds of things that could limit just in essence, the ability for the federal government to regulate. And that's really scary. Where we do see a lot of movement, I think, is sort of on the state and local level. I'm a reporter at the Boston Globe, where essentially in Boston, the mayor has undertaken a pretty bold Green New Deal campaign, and it has launched a pretty huge series of sort of smaller Green New Deal kinds of policies, from starting to try to make transit free to beginning conversations about green housing and housing justice and things like this. But I think that what we're seeing there is sort of similar to what we're seeing all over the United States, wherein an agenda and a campaign does not essentially, you need a lot more than that to sort of make things happen. And when it comes to climate policy, anyone in the US is going to be fighting against a long history of the blocked climate policy, of ignored climate policy. And so the battles are really, I think, uphill, even in, the sort of most liberal quarters of the United States. My hope for, I guess, this COP and for the future is essentially that, I think it would be pretty silly for me to expect much to come out of this COP. It would be pretty silly for me to kind of look to this COP and think, oh, I hope that this results in a broad sort of loss and damages program that acknowledges, all of the sort of past wrongs of, sort of hegemonic nations, that acknowledges the long history of sort of climate injustice. That's not going to happen, but one can hope, right? I guess maybe the very least that I would hope is that it's clear on the global stage to everyone how hypocritical it is when major emitters come and sort of shed tears about the floods in Pakistan and things like this, and then refuse to do anything about it. I hope that it becomes clear that the major emitters at these COPs are the problem, and that they're not sort of walking the walk when it comes to international negotiations. So if that's all that we get out of this COP, I think that will both be really disappointing and also in some ways a win in comparison to what we've seen in the past.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a couple of questions in the chat. I can ask you if you would like to say them yourself. Tatet, would you want to ask your question directly?
No, I'm good. I sound bad.
Okay, I'll ask it for you. So the US is spending huge amount of money to reestablish itself as a climate champion, supposedly, both domestically and internationally. But at the COPs, as you mentioned, it's been misbehaving. It's a bully. It blocks developing countries from calling for loss and damages, aka reparations. And there's no indication that any of this will change at this COP 27. Yes. So how do the US movements see this glaring disconnect between prose and praxis, especially because it's really, as you said, it's really hard at a time when rising inflation, it's hard to there are these crises going on in the US. So how are movements reacting to this kind of disconnect?
People are angry, right? That's a way that people in the US are reacting. And that's something I would rather that people be angry than not know that this disconnect exists. But I think that, understandably, the idea of taking on something like, something as powerful as the United States in an arena that's as powerful as these international negotiations feels really, really daunting. Mm-hmm. I think that might be part of the reason that we have seen this sort of focus on immediate sort of domestic policy and sort of a tendency to turn away from international policies because it just feels really daunting. But I do think that people are starting to see the disconnect more and more. And, I think that as we see more and more sort of coverage of disasters abroad, and as, sort of various bodies sort of start to connect the dots between legacies of colonialism and climate change, I think it will be harder to ignore. The question will be how movements can do anything about that, and obviously there's an uphill battle there. If there's ever been an uphill battle, that is maybe the biggest one that that the climate movement is sort of facing. But I mean, certainly I think that people recognize that the disconnect is there. And I think that while it is very difficult to sort of keep people's eyes on climate policy, let alone climate policy abroad, when there's a cost of living crisis here, I do think that, there are movements who are sort of starting to understand that that there are ways to sort of make life better for people in the United States while also, sort of making life better for people abroad. I think that people are sort of starting to move beyond this austerity mindset of either we can have it really good and they over there can't, or this idea that we, in order to have it sort of have a livable future that we need to sort of have fewer like life I mean, privileges is a thing that we will obviously need less of, but for instance, the idea that we have to have horrible lives, that we have to just give up things that we love in order to have a livable future. People are starting to look beyond that, and I think sort of start to ask, why is it that we don't have more public transit, more electrified public transit? That would mean that we need to mine less abroad. And also that would mean that we can, have to pay less for our cars here. There are ways to address all of these things at the same time, and seizing those opportunities, I think, is really important.
Totally.
Sorry, that was such a great question and I gave such a long-winded answer.
No, it's actually quite helpful. And I think actually we'd be remiss to not talk about this in this call as well, that the IRA did close a ton of tax loopholes, which is climate policy. By taxing billionaires and taxing multi-millionaires as well, that income not being spent on profligate air travel or anything like that is actually a form of climate policy in itself as well. And at a time of rising inequality in the US as well, it's not everyone that is struggling, but it is kind of a major feel. Seva had a really great question kind of about building alliance of actors with shared goals. And what is the role of trade unions in the US when it comes to the climate movement? Are they active? Is there a conversation on the national scale with the AFL-CIO, for example, or is it more isolated to local level? And specifically, is there a discussion on just transition within the US from unions bringing social dimensions into the climate discussion, or is it a concept not as relevant within the US internal discussions?
On the national level, I think it's really hard to get a lot done in the United States. The United States is a really huge country, and we've been fed for years this idea that states should be in charge of everything. But I mean, there have been certainly discussions of a just transition on the national level, though, both in ways that unions have been supportive of and in ways, frankly, that unions have not been supportive of. There are sort of glimmers here, though, in, for instance, Texas, in Maine, in Rhode Island, the AFL-CIO has been working with climate organizers to sort of create these jobs first platforms, that essentially climate platforms that say, here is a plan to decarbonize every sector of the economy in a way that also creates good union jobs. Essentially bringing a sort of Green New Deal framework into the labor space. And so there's definitely movement in this, on this front. I mean, but also we're in a nation where not so long ago, the man who is currently our president said that coal miners should just learn to code. So I think there's sort of no surprise that many people are very skeptical when the words just transition are evoked. And I know that something that you've, sort of often raised, Erin, is that while a just transition is really important for workers here in the US, for the folks who, could be losing jobs in these sort of hopefully waning industries. And I think that's really important. A just transition should also consider the many workers who are implicated in climate policy everywhere else. If you work in a lithium mine, you should also be able to have a just transition into a future where if more lithium is being mined, your life isn't completely destroyed by that. And your wages are protected, and your family is protected and things like this. So, yes, I think it's definitely a relevant framework. It's one that there's definitely some skepticism about, I think for good reason in the US. And it's also one that I think that we could definitely stand to expand.
I think that's exactly right. And I think there is also, the only coda I'd add to that is that generally from society, I think people are starting to broaden the idea from most impacted community, specifically within labor, and viewing the climate crisis as something that will impact every sector within society. And so it's not a problem for teachers unions to come out in full-fledged support of Green New Deal policies, or nurses unions to come out in full-fledged support of climate policy, because they are also impacted and affected in ways that they may have kept their mouths shut a few years ago, deferring to building trades. It's
a really good point. A major teachers union just earlier this year sort of endorsed a sort of climate focused agenda, essentially a sort of Green New Deal, sort of professed the need to integrate climate concerns into everything that it did. We saw National Nurses United, a major nurses union here in the United States, come out hard for the Green New Deal for years.
Yeah.
And so, I think certainly that there are many parts of the labor movement who are sort of moving toward this conclusion faster than others. But it's exciting to be living in a time when, a teachers union can sort of take on climate policy and realize that it's, that it's for all of us. Climate policy is something that's for all of us. It's not just something that affects people in the energy sector. It's something that affects, our children, our schools, the schools that the school buildings, our curricula, everything. So it's exciting to see.
Cool. I'm gonna pass it over to Gaia because she wrote she can explain more in her question. So Gaia, take it away for your question.
Hey, thanks, Aaron, and thanks, Dharna. This has been such a great conversation that you've both been having. I had a question, so it's kind of related to, we've been talking about, I think amongst the many problems that we have, and Titet highlighted one, which is the US climate movement is slow to look outwards and take on the responsibility of that as part of their sort of practice. And I think one of the sort of associated challenges of that, and we've talked a lot, and we always talk about the need to build this working class solidarity internationally, right? But then it never sort of takes shape or form, something that we can actually see and touch. So, and I think we can see this moment as like having more challenges or more opportunities. On one hand, it's hard because there is like a serious cost of living crisis, like spreading across Europe and America and the North America. And we know how much like that's going to impact people. It's going to make them look more and more inwards. So I'm just wondering if maybe our role is to build a project that is unifying and there's something for everybody in it, and have like a unifying demand. And we had a really interesting conversation in our last session of the series with Stefano Prato from the Society for International Development. And he was talking about how there is a movement that has been put forward by the African group for a global tax regime. And I think, in Europe, in North America, the excuse that if you put up taxes, all your billionaires are going to leave, the fact that there are offshore tax havens, like, would something like that be something that could actually unite people and actually start like to have an international solidarity sort of program that would actually start to take on some of those structural problems with the global imperial system around something like tax, which touches everyone and you can sell it to everyone and everyone can see benefit for themselves in that?
Sure. Definitely. I think that, there are definitely, I think that, sort of connecting the dots between, the various nations that are grappling with these issues, between tax policy and climate policy, certainly I think there's an opening for this. I know that this is something, for instance, that you all are starting to work on. Just to call it a couple of others, I know that folks at Public Citizens, Global Trade Watch, and People's Actions, Justice is Global, are also sort of keeping a close eye on these implications. And, you know, as you do build this, you know, I would love to write about it. I mean, I think that there are a lot of exciting sort of futures here. And I think, you know, especially anything that sort of ties the sort of short-term economic future of the United States to, you know, sort of places abroad is a good thing. It's really important, I think, for folks to remember that when we talk about this thing called the economy, it's not just something that affects, you know, us here in the United States. It's something that's connected to everywhere else, especially when we talk about the energy system. So yes, I mean, please keep me posted.
Okay, I think we're just about at time. Is there anything that you want to plug of your work or anything? Give you just an opportunity to do that. Otherwise, or do you intend to write about COP at all? And so people should look out for that. But otherwise, just really want to thank you so much for joining us today. I think this was a really fruitful discussion and really gave us what we needed or wanted from this. And so really, truly appreciate it, Dharna.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you can find my work at globe.com/climate, where, you know, the Boston Globe is essentially building a climate initiative that's aiming to speak to both an international and national audience and the audience that we have in Boston and Massachusetts. We're definitely going to be covering COP and attempting to sort of make the broadest international issues accessible to our audience, which will be fun and very easy. I promise you that. Just kidding. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dharna Noor. Also, thank you all so much for having me. It's been such a, you know, sort of fruitful conversation, and one that I know has really gotten me thinking. And I hope that we could help you all sort of think about how to move forward in these really challenging times.
And then the last question from Tatet was, will you personally be at COP?
I wish. I will not be attending in Egypt this year, but I wish that I was.
So next year, perhaps. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Dharna. Thank you all for joining us. We'll also have a recording of this because we know there were a bunch of people, especially within our foundation, that really want to catch up and watch this as well. So it'll be distributed. Thank you all for joining. Truly appreciate it. Thank you to our colleagues in the Philippines, Geneva, and New York that put this whole on together. So have a great day or evening, everyone. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you, and thanks for the great questions, Aaron. Take care.
Cool. Bye-bye.